how the exposure triangle can help your real estate photography. Hi and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Rick, real estate photographer, podcaster and all things photographing buildings. Welcome to my YouTube channel, and this is what I'm writing about this week on my blog. First off, here's the answer. The exposure triangle helps real estate photographers get the correct exposure by selecting the correct aperture, shutter speed and ISO for the subject matter and lighting in the composition. These settings can be selected by the camera, the user or a combination of the two, and are adjusted by the user in challenging lighting using the exposure triangle. Okay, that was the answer. So in this blog post, what is the exposure triangle? Let's start off at the beginning. I think it's rude to assume that people know all this stuff. The exposure triangle is the combination of aperture, shutter speed and ISO which work together to create a correctly exposed photo, or an incorrectly exposed photo if not set correctly. Now, if you want to know more about aperture, shutter and ISO and which are the best apertures, best shutter speeds and best ISOs for real estate photography, no problem, check out my blog McEvoyphotography.com or check out the previous videos on my YouTube channel because I've covered those three, and this seemed to be the logical next thing to wrap up this nice little series. Okay, so it all makes sense, doesn't it? And it's all good stuff, and I explain everything in plain English. So how do you know what settings to use? Well, your camera's got a meter built into it, and when you press the shutter release button, that normally, I'm saying normally because I don't know how your camera's set up, you might have done something funky and quirky to it which I don't know about. Normally, when you press the shutter release button halfway, it takes an exposure and it focuses. I say normally because I do something different, but when we're talking about exposure, that's what happens. So the camera will tell you what the correct exposure is. Now, if you're in manual mode, you have to choose all the settings yourself. If you're in a semi-automatic mode, such as the one I use, AV, the ISO is set, and I set the aperture that I want, and the camera chooses the shutter speed to give me the correct exposure. All good then. And then there's the fully automatic mode where the camera just does everything for you, which I don't use, and nothing wrong with them, but I like to specify an aperture because that's giving me the best quality and the correct depth of field for a photo that I take. Okay, so using AV mode, I don't need to worry about the exposure triangle too much because my camera's on a tripod. I've got the correct exposure. And if I let you into a little secret here, I use auto bracketing. Now that means I take 3 photos, 1 the correct exposure, 1 2 stops overexposed and 1 2 stops underexposed. Put the 3 together in Lightroom and I've got a wider range than I can do with a single shot. However, in challenging lighting conditions, I might have to change something. And in the blog post, I go through some of these scenarios. So challenging lighting, it's a problem. You need to know how to deal with it. Now, like me, if you use auto bracketing, that gets you around a lot of the problems, but you need to understand this. It's a fundamental of taking photographs. So check out the blog post for the answers, but these are the things that I write about. You take a photo and it's too light. How do you use the exposure triangle to correct it? You take an underexposed image. How do you use the exposure triangle to correct it? These things I'm answering. Also, things like if you want a specific shutter speed, how do you use the exposure triangle to make sure you get the correct exposure for the photo? Same with a specific aperture. And for completeness, I've put in if you want a specific ISO. Now, I used the lowest base ISO on my Canon 6D, which is 100. In general terms, the lower the ISO, the better the quality of the photos and the less chance of you getting noise or other nasty stuff in a photo. So I very rarely use the exposure triangle to select a higher ISO. What happens in reality is, if I need a faster shutter speed because I have to shoot handheld, then I will use a higher ISO to give me the higher shutter speed without changing the aperture. And that's That's how the exposure triangle works. You're using the 3 settings to get the correct exposure, but also using the settings that you want and need. Okay? What do I do? Well, I explain what I do. ISO 100, camera on a tripod, aperture f8. Camera chooses the shutter speed because I'm photographing buildings and they're not moving and my camera's on a tripod. Keeping it nice and simple. I've mentioned auto bracketing, challenging situations. And then I give you a few other situations where you need to know this stuff. Now, if I'm in a tight corner and there isn't room to get my camera on a tripod in the corner, then I'll have to shoot handheld. Another thing I do is I shoot photos with my camera on a painter's pole. So if it's 4 or 5 meters up in the air, waving around, I need a fast shutter speed and I need to be able to control that, and I use the exposure triangle for that. And also for unusual funkiness like photographing a live gravel unloading facility on a rail siding, I had to use a painter's pole there. I couldn't physically get to where I needed to take the photos because it wasn't safe. So the pole saved me. Important that you know this. Right, I'm done. Check out rickmcavoyphotography.com/real estate photography, where I will list loads of the posts that I've written on this wonderful subject. And why not check out my splendid Photography Explained podcast? Website photographyexplainedpodcast.com. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I will see you on the next one, which will be published next Monday. Cheers from me, Rick.